what is the difference between burnout, stress, and anxiety?
I'll use a lot of these words interchangeably just because we're not always necessarily talking about the clinical definition in day-to-day life. And we all experience levels of stress, anxiety, at moments burnout. And then, of course, a lot of us do actually have clinical burnout, or at least are on the scale of it. Stress essentially is an external element. So there's something in your environment that's triggering a stress response. And then anxiety is usually the reaction. It's more internal. And a huge piece of this is that stress usually has a beginning, a middle, and an end, whereas anxiety might persist even if the stressor that was originally there is no longer present. So that's why when you say that you're feeling anxious, it's because you have all of these internal worries, you're feeling very tense, things like that. Burnout is related to both of them. It's specifically prolonged stress. So you're chronically experiencing stress over a long period of time and it's not being relieved. And this might be perceived or actual, but it's really the perception that you don't have enough resources to combat the demands that you have that really leads to being burnt out.
What are healthy strategies and guardrails to establish to postpone the next bout of burnout?
The first thing is being aware that you experience burnout or a high level of stress. And then to go a step further and try and recognize the causes. So if you understand what got you there to begin with, that sets you up for being able to navigate moving forward to try and avoid what got you there in the first place. And I really like the keyword that you said in there, which is healthy coping mechanisms, because there's a lot of unhealthy coping mechanisms. And there are a lot of different types of coping mechanisms. There's some where you're directly solving the problem, others that are focused on the emotion or trying to positively reappraise or rethink the stress that you're experiencing. And then, of course, there's some people who go into avoidant or distracting options like cigarette, alcohol, you name it. I think we've all are well aware of ways that aren't actually helpful that might just be a Band-Aid to get you through that current moment.
Wait, so binging Terrace House for 2 seasons in a week, that's maladaptive?
Depends. That brings up probably what we'll get into later is a big piece of being burnt out is incorporating time where you're recharging. A lot of times people put a lot of burden on themselves if they're like, oh, I'm binge watching a show, I'm not doing anything. But if that's actually helping you to really experience joy and pleasure, and then you're able to jump back in and do your work after, then not necessarily. So depends on the context.
All right. Well, Harvard-trained coach said I could, why not? Watch Netflix now. Yeah, I get it. So it really depends on what you need at the time. But what do you do when you're in burnout? When I burn out, I get guilty about feeling burnt out, and then I feel even worse. So how do you recover from it in a healthy but efficient way?
My heart goes out to everyone that's experiencing now. I think the biggest thing is everything comes and goes in waves. It's temporary what you're going through now, but you do have an active role in getting yourself out of it. Self-compassion is really helpful. I heard the word guilt in there. Our society tends to have a word we use a lot is weaponizing stress and burnout and resilience. So a lot of times it will be used against us. And then we have these feelings of I shouldn't be feeling this way. I should be able to produce or accomplish or do the things that whatever's on your agenda without feeling stressed out. Take a look at what are the core functions, maybe even take a step back at what are your goals and how is what you're doing aligned to those goals and values and what's misaligned, because a lot of times burnout comes from the misalignment. Taking a look at where you're finding joy and where you can find some pleasure in day to day. And it doesn't have to be, I emphasize this a lot in a lot of my content, it doesn't mean taking hours out of your day, a week, a month to do something pleasurable. It can be as simple as in between meetings, taking 5 minutes for yourself to just get out of your chair or take 10 seconds to take some deep breaths, things like that. The self-compassion and really being understanding and going in with a curious mind. How did I get here? What are different ways that I can think about this? How have I not thought about it before? Can help you get from where you are now to a place that's a little less burnt out. That too, a lot of times we want the end goal, even with burnout, of I want to be completely not burnt out. But it's easier to think about how do I get to a place where I'm like 1% less burnt out. And from there, you can gradually work yourself down to a more calm and relaxed state.
Breaking that apart, how much do you think if someone's feeling burnout, should they reduce the workload versus getting more resources to handle the work?
That I would say is situational. The research shows that your own personal coping skills are the thing that's most correlated with how you manage burnout, your reduction of burnout, and prevention of burnout. But like right up there is social support. So you can reach out for social support to get more resources and the tools and skills you need to be able to cope with the current pressures and demands you have. Or the situation might render that you really have too much on your plate and you just simply can't handle it. Because when I'm speaking about resources, it can be physical objects. It can also be your personality traits. It can be your energy levels. So it depends on what resources you feel depleted of. And again, it can be also a threat. It doesn't have to be that you actually don't have resources. Like if I know I'm going to just mention the nurse situation, but this can apply to any situation. A lot of times nurses get burnt out because of the staffing situation. So maybe they're not understaffed now, but if they're hearing when that layoffs are coming, that might trigger burnout to start because they are perceiving that there might be a threat coming their way. So that can apply in different situations, especially in the creator world.
Especially right now, I think with creators, there's always like infinite amounts of uncertainty. Same with being an entrepreneur. And right now, if someone's out there is like a working professional, especially like I'm in San Francisco and in tech, there's so many layoffs like Facebook, Google, all these companies. For people that are like what you just mentioned, there's like a perceived risk of being laid off. How do you manage that kind of chronic, something looming over your head, a perceived threat that's not going to go away anytime soon?
A lot of it is thinking about what you have control over and controlling your thoughts. So it's reframing and reappraisal, or how you appraise a situation. So your thoughts are really, really powerful in how you're assessing the situation, taking a look. Do you have any form of autonomy or agency in the situation if you're hearing about the layoff coming? Does it trigger perfectionism or an overworking where you're like, I can't be the one who let me step it up. And then that ultimately turns into your burnout. Even if you do end up not getting laid off, what was the benefit? What was the cost of your response to whatever the threat is?
Can you tie it back to a little bit tell us a little bit about the takeaways you had from your research with the nurses?
Yeah. So I ended up doing the research during the pandemic, which definitely had influence over some of the results. But I found, which I alluded to a little bit a few moments ago, the biggest factor was the nurse's own personal coping mechanism. So huge emphasis on taking care of yourself and building your resilience and your skills, and essentially having like a handy tool set that you can tap into when you're feeling stressed out or anxious so that you can prevent burnout before it comes through. The other really striking result I found was that social support was key. That part's not surprising. What was the most thing I should say is that it was social support from the nurse's direct supervisor. So I looked at family members, I looked at the organization, I looked at a few different factors, but what that told me was it really matters how much the person that you're seeking social support can actually do something for your situation. So it's great if you are really stressed out and you go home to your friend or your spouse or a parent, whoever, and you can vent to them. There's value in that. It definitely helped. But the most helpful was going to a supervisor. And this part I'm extrapolating, but I imagine that if they are feeling or leaning towards being burnt out, it's because, again, they don't have enough resources. So they let their supervisor know, and their supervisor has direct influence over those resources that ultimately are contributing to their stress, which turns to burnout.
For someone listening out there today, what is one thing you hope they take away from this whole conversation?
Hope they take away that it is possible to be really productive and calm.
If you enjoy that, then press here for the full unedited interview. And if you want to see more of her content, check her out here. And if you want more creative business tips, then press here to subscribe to The Inner Creator. Love yourself, love others, and have an awesome day.